Hey y'all, welcome to Recover by Christ. It is me, Jay, and I want to take this next week or two to really discuss a topic that was really formative for me. And it was actually the season that I encountered grief in a very deep and personal way. You know, it's interesting. Grief has an eclectic group of avenues that it can end up in your life. It can come through relationships that are lost, and the people might still be alive, but your connection to them is not what it once was or what you hoped it would be. It can come from the loss of resource, from the loss of jobs, from the loss of communities, from the loss of vehicles, houses. It can come from anything. For me, my deepest grief came when my little brother and best friend died in a car crash. He was killed by a drunk driver on his way to work. And in that, I was blindsided, right? And I had never dealt with, listen, I got homies who have died. Like my best friend from third grade died on me. I was messaging him to say happy Thanksgiving, and his mom was like, "You haven't heard yet?" I'm like, oh my gosh. And, you know, my other best friend, I had another best friend from high school, hadn't heard from him for a while. And something in my spirit was just like, hey, Google his name. And I found his obituary from like 6 months earlier. And it actually just happened again here lately. I was like, man, I haven't heard about homie. So I Googled his name and found out he died like a year ago. And I'm like, golly, man, like people die. And you can be prepared for that. You can know it's going to happen, but there's something different when tragedy sneaks into your life and you are unprepared. And the thing is that grief is actually natural. You know, it's kind of a cliche when you get into certain communities that are dealing with grief, whether they be, I don't know, grief share groups or processing groups, what have you. What they say is grief is actually a sign that you loved that deeply. If you didn't love, you couldn't grieve. And that's kind of true, right? But there's also this reality about grief where it's inevitable. Someone you love, someone that's close to you, will die in your lifetime at least once, right? And in that, how are you processing that? Like, the reality is there's a time for everything. It says this in Ecclesiastes. There's a time for mourning, right? So there's a time for grief. The problem is when you don't know how to handle grief, grief starts to kind of handle you. And that's what happened to me. When my brother died, I lost myself for 18 months. And mind you, I had just had my first child was born 2 weeks earlier. And so I should be enthralled in the journey of being a new dad and in my marriage and all these things. And I'm so hijacked by grief. I'm not present as a father or as a husband, as a minister, and a spiritual leader. I was not pulling the weight that I think I ought to have. And I was really disconnected, right? It took me some time to realize that grief was getting out from under me. And so in that, I started kind of learning, okay, how does grief function? And how do I wouldn't say that you can minimize it. I wouldn't say that you can direct it. I wouldn't say that it's like this control mechanism, but it's almost like if you know where, when, and how it likes to come up, you can start to give it direction. You can start to give it some shape. For example, I almost always go into grief in the fall. That's when my brother died. That's when my son was born. That was my brother's birthday. It's also my wife's birthday and my son's and my anniversary. And so there's like just this peak season for like a 45-day window. It's also when I got sober. In that same 45-day span. And so it's like these peak emotional experiences. And to close them off is my brother's birthday, which is a little over a week after the day he died. And so I always crash out at that point. And knowing that, what I start to do is I start to practice these principles that actually put you ahead of grief. And so I just want to really point out the blatantly obvious. The question I'm trying to answer today is, can you get ahead of grief, or does grief just get out from under you from now on for the rest of your life? The first thing I would like to point out to giving you guidance in that is, despite what grief says, God is present. You see, we do this thing where we ask God questions and he doesn't give us answers. We seek God's miracles and we don't see them manifest. And we feel like God's disengaged, or God's not present, or he doesn't care. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Hebrews 13:5 says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that's actually a quote. Like, it's an echo of scripture that God is not gonna leave you. And so in that, the first thing in grief is recognizing, like, God is sitting here with me in this. And all the emotion and the hijacking that grief is known to do, it is something that God is a witness to. Like, God's not this ethereal character outside of your grief expecting you to get through it. He's inside of the grief with you. And when you start to see that, you can actually lean into God. And in my grief, what I found is that leaning into God actually did more than I realized, and it did more than I knew how to ask for. My prayers were, God, would you just tell me something? Would you just say this or do that? And it was silent, and he looked inactive. But over time, I realized he was just sitting there, and I would just be like, God, I need you to, like, say something right now. This is insane. Like, tell me something to get me through this, or do something that, like, take the pain away or something. And it's almost like I would just, like, look across the room, or look across the couch, and he would just be like, I know, man. I know, but I'm here. It's like, you know what? And he's like, I know how you feel. I can't change it. I could, but I'm not going to. But I'm here with you. You know, it says that Jesus became like a man in all aspects, that he would actually encounter our trials. I'm butchering the scripture, but it'll be on the screen by the time you're watching this. And so in that, he became acquainted with the human nature. And it's actually really interesting, because when you think about grief, you want to understand the spiritual dynamics, yes, but you also want to know, like, how does God expect me to respond, right? And, you know, everybody, like, don't challenge God, don't question God, and just keep having faith, and, like, all these real things. But let's be honest with ourselves, that's hard. So like, for example, Jesus lived and walked and experienced everything. How did Jesus experience grief? I think of no better story than the one we see in John chapter 14. I'm just going to have the reference on the screen because there's really a lot of text here. But what happens is John's cousin, and what I would like to assume is his childhood friend, much like a little brother, just got beheaded for being on the same mission that he was on. And you would think that Jesus would say, hey, I'm taking a sabbatical. We're going to push the ministry on pause for a minute. I need some time. Disciples only, or maybe even no disciples. Maybe I'm going to go home to Nazareth for a minute. No. I think there's like this nuance when you start looking in the scripture that he seems like he was trying to maybe get a moment alone, but he didn't get that. Shortly after is when the 5,000 show up, according to John's account. And what does Jesus do? He actually starts feeding the 5,000. And it's actually not until he enters the fellowship and community of believers and followers of Christ. I mean, they're his followers. It's not until after that he gets a moment to himself. And I think in grief, we run to these moments from ourselves. And I think what we're seeing in Jesus is he's running towards community. Not running towards community, but he's embracing community. Let me reword that. Now, who runs towards community is Ruth. Ruth is a short book. We often read about Ruth and Boaz, and Ruth being this hard worker and Boaz being this kinsman redeemer. And I'm using a lot of churchanese right now, but I want you to, whether you're a believer or not, read Ruth and understand that it is from its foundation dealing with death. This woman and her two sons are going through a famine, and they move to a distant land where the food is more plentiful. And you know what? Her husband dies. And then guess what? Both her sons, whom have married, die. And she's left with these two daughter-in-laws, and all her husband and her boys are dead. And what happens is she decides to go home, and wouldn't you know it, Ruth, who just lost her husband, her brother-in-law, and her father-in-law in some amount of time, decides to pursue community. She pursues Naomi. And she says to Naomi, like, I'm going to go where you're going to go. I'm going to do what you're going to do. And your people are going to be my people. She's coping by pressing into community. Jesus coped by engaging the community that was with him. And so I think despite how we feel, healthy grief looks like fellowship. That's why the word says, weep with those who weep. Right? There's supposed to be a community in that. And that goes on both sides. If you know someone who is going through grief, they're not going to want you around, but you have to be annoyingly available. And if you are going through grief right now, you're not going to want anyone around, but you have to accept the annoyance. Let them see you in your jammies, couch locked for 3 days, smelling like you need a shower, and tons of McDonald's and Pizza Hut on the shelf, or trash everywhere. Let them see that, but also let them show you they care. Because what you just did was you just lost something that was so close to you that it's fragmented. It's shattered parts of your heart, mind, body, and soul, literally. And in that, you need the medication of fellowship. And I would even just kind of pivot from the grief and give you another biblical story, because there's two things you can do in grief. One is you can over intellectualize it and get busy and start hardening your heart, which is actually shutting you off to the grief. It's not processing the grief though, bro. Like, you're just shoving it down, and you're kind of like stuffing it inside, and it like burrows into your soul and starts to eat you alive. And that's actually when I started to get the most hijacked by grief, was when I was doing it that way. There's the other side of this, which is that you let grief come out of you. You either push it down or let it out, right? Look at John in chapter 11. This is Martha and Mary. They're brother. And this was a close family. Like, the nuance of scripture is that Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were close. And Martha and Mary don't know that Lazarus is coming back from the dead, right? And literally, Martha runs up first. She's like, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus reasons with her through intellect, because that's where she met him. She's standing up. She's not letting the grief out. She's actually stuffing it down and trying to overcome it. And Jesus meets her there. And he's like, yeah, I am the resurrection, right? And she's like, what? And like, it goes down like that. And it's this deeply theological thing where Jesus is trying to comfort her in the theology of death and resurrection. And then shortly after that, Mary comes out. And Mary, it says she fell to his feet weeping and cried out the exact same thing as Martha. Won't point that out, but she cries out, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And you know what? It says Jesus wept. The point I'm trying to make here is, no matter what phase you do, Jesus meets you there. But one of you, when you stuff the grief down and try to hide it and ignore it and hope that it goes away today, and you use your brain, Jesus meets you in your brain. If you say, I don't care about understanding it, I know if you were here and I'm falling apart at your feet and I'm weeping, then Jesus weeps with us. Mind you, Jesus knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. I mean, look just earlier in the text, his disciples say something about, Lazarus, and Jesus says he's asleep. And they say, well, if he's asleep, then why are we going? And he says, he's not asleep, he's dead, but this is not the sleep of death. Like, we're going to wake him up kind of thing. And I might've jumbled the words there, but the point being, Jesus knew he was about to raise him from the dead. I have it in good faith that what we're seeing in John 11 is God teaching us how he interacts with our grief. Because God knows my brother is going to resurrect and be called into account for his life, whether he believed in Jesus or not, per John 3:16 through 19. And I know that there is life after this for my brother. So does God. But there's grief to be dealt with. And so in that, I'm actually going to talk about this next week. Is going to be more of a testimony on next week's episode. You need to understand how to manage grief with a relationship with God, because if you don't, the alternative is getting given to a spirit of grief. I hate to be so harsh, but there's only three options in my head. There is the coping of the flesh, which is finding a way to do it. Some people turn to alcohol. Some people turn to workaholic mentality. Some people turn to money. A lot of marriages collapse. And then people become very promiscuous. A lot of people just turn to video games. A lot of people get given to depression and anxiety. A lot of normal go that way. Then there's this spirit of grief, which is where you literally enter into a stronghold, and that's how you compensate for the grief. You kind of more or less submit yourself to a spirit of grief, and it makes the grief manageable because you're now in agreement with grief. And then the third way is you get through it with God, bro, and let God teach you what healthy grief looks like. Andrew Huberman does this podcast about the neuroscience of grief. And what he says is essentially grief boils down to, and I'm dramatically paraphrasing, like a 2-hour-long podcast with like a Stanford like neuroscientist. But what he says is, in the essence, my takeaway was death hacks into the neuroscience of object permanence. So my brother died. Everything in my life that had a directive towards my brother now has no direction. Every emotion, every intention, every thought, every ambition, every time that I find a funny short that I want to send him on YouTube, every time I'm bored and I'm reminded of a gift that I want to send him, there's no one to send it to now. And the grief is triggered. Every time a song comes on that reminds me of him, then I remember that he's not here. I can't share that song with him right now. The object permeates. My dreams don't have a place to go anymore. My affections don't have a place to go anymore. My ideas and inspirations and the stories I want to share, there's no one to share that with now. All of those things are gone. And that's kind of the crux of grief and why it's so entrenched in who you are, because there's so many phases of your body, mind, spirit, and soul that are connected to this person. I used to go camping with my brother. That was like the only thing. Like he's like the only person I really dig camping with. And now it's like, I don't go camping with anybody. My body doesn't get to experience that anymore. And I mean, I'll redeem it, sure, like by the Lord's help for like my son and my wife and stuff. But like there's that nuance to it, right? In that, you have to understand how to maneuver the grief. You know, I talked earlier about how hard it is for me in the fall. I have to do things that express the grief in ways that I view as healthy. I partner with God and I do things that make that let the grief out. And then when it is his birthday and I am at a family event and I see the empty chair, the grief isn't overwhelming me because I've been letting it out in healthy ways up to that moment. Now the grief is there. I feel the sorrow. I feel the absence. I feel the emotion, but it doesn't hijack me. And that's what I mean when I say, can you get ahead of the grief? Can you moderate how the grief is being expressed enough that when it's overwhelming, you have enough self-control to keep moving in a healthy direction towards fellowship and towards the Lord? That's really it. And, you know, if you were like, well, how does a program head run this? It's like, well, step 2, you have to believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity. And for all intents and purposes, grief is insane, bro. It takes you to a state of insanity. And then in step 3, it says like we surrender our life and will to the care of God as we understand him. And so I don't understand any of this, Lord, why you didn't change it, why you didn't stop it. You have all those thoughts, but you say, you know what, Lord, whether it makes sense or not, I'm surrendered to you. I submit to you. And then it's step 11 where you say like, hey, I'm going to continue to seek conscious contact with God through this grief. None of it makes sense, but I just want to know his will and I want to have the power to carry it out today because I am broken and struggling to get through. My point that like the be all end all that I'm trying to make today is grief is natural. It is a part of being human. There is a godly way for you to get through the grief. There is a fleshly way for you to get through the grief. And then there's a spiritual, like I would call it demonic way to get through the grief. I want to frame the conclusion this way. You can run into a stronghold with the spirit of grief or a spirit of anger and rage and murder at the person who did it. Or you can start practicing the fruits of the flesh so much, eating and drinking and smoking and all the things, so that it's just numb now. And those are demonic, albeit, yeah, but there's also a dynamic where it's not about the spiritual comfort for you. It's actually about the spiritual numbing through the overindulgence of the flesh. And then there's the third thing, which is there's a godly way to do this. And that's how you get ahead of the grief. You recognize where it's at in the word. You recognize God is going to be here. God himself in the flesh engaged fellowship. And then God gave us examples of how he connects to our expressions of grief. And so I need to start finding healthy ways to express my grief. And I need to understand it enough that I'm ahead of it instead of responding to it. It's a proactive with grief. Look, I still grieve, bro. But the grief doesn't tell me how my day's going to go. I tell the grief, when I can feel it, I have different things I do to help me let it out. And based on the day, based on the scenario, I let the grief out in the way that's most fitting in that moment. And I always feel better afterwards. And the next time the grief comes, it's manageable enough for me to say, okay, I just need to take like 30 minutes and go do this thing. Go for a walk, go do a journal entry. Look at pictures of my brother, pray about my brother, watch videos of my brother. Like I have all these coping mechanisms. That is how a natural person grieves, in my opinion, is you learn how to love the person and honor who they were and not get destroyed by their absence. Like I think about if my brother walked in the room and he saw me so broken that I couldn't function, wouldn't he be like, man, I don't want to see you like this? I know he would. On the flip side, if my brother walked in and saw me writing him a letter and maybe I'm crying and then saw me put that down and get up and go play with my son and be a good dad, my brother would say, like, I know he would be proud of me. He would be like, man, you're being a good dad. I miss you, bro. And that's what healthy, natural grief looks like. Honoring those you're grieving, not using them as an excuse to live a dishonorable life. And I know grief is hard enough that I would never talk down on a person, but this is me. I'm sharing my story. For the first 18 months of my grief, I lived a dishonorable life. I was given to food. I was given to outburst of emotion. I was given to video games and movies. I was barely present. I was physically present, but not mentally or emotionally or spiritually for my wife or my son. And, my wife's a trooper and she got through those 18 months with me. But it wasn't until I started getting ahead of the grief that I started being emotionally available again, that I started having attention to give to my wife and my son, and that I started being spiritually minded. Like, how do I steward my household through this? And so I just want to encourage you to really focus, not on not on anesthetizing it through the flesh, not on finding spiritual comfort through the solace of grief, but turning towards the Lord and saying, Lord, how do I naturally grieve X, Y, or Z? And he will show you how to do that in a way that honors the things and people and places you've lost, not in a way that hinders what you have left. And that is when you'll know that your grief has been recovered by Christ. I want that for you. Trust me. I've seen the difference a life recovered by Christ can make, and I want to see it in your life as much as I've seen it in mine. Be blessed.